Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We'll start off with Shaman Tilakaratna, Director Tax Services, PwC. Shaman, I don't want to go to the numbers now. I want to talk about the budget as a whole. Budget 2018, we know January there's going to be an election. Is this why this budget has not spoken too much about taxes or big changes, reforms? Nothing of that sort has been really coming through in this budget. And you expected there to be drastic tax increases. You expected there to be drastic reforms in the budget. Is this budget targeted simply at the January polls?
Well, Shamir, to be fair and to give credit to the government, if it was targeted with the election, they could have actually introduced a host of tax concessions, which they have not done, and that's easy to do. So you see an increase in the direct taxes, and the direct taxes they have not touched because they've brought in all the reforms through the Inland Revenue Act, which is now law. And to maintain consistency, they have not made any significant changes to that. So I think they've done a good balancing act, or else we would have, like as in the past, seen sweeping concessions, which is not the case this time.
You say a balancing act. That's a very harsh word to use in a post-budget era. So you're trying to say that this government is just trying to survive the day.
See, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is there is a big loan they need to repay. They need money, and our tax to GDP ratio is low, and it's been improved over the last few years, but it's low, and we need revenue, and tax is the one way to get it. So here we have a situation where we can't now touch the direct taxes because we've just come out of a reform stage for direct taxes, and the only other alternative is to increase your indirect taxes. Of course, placing reliance on border taxes or import taxes is a little dicey, because should that import percentage change, your revenue will go down. For example, motor vehicles and in the liquor industry. I mean, for some, if the taxes seem to have by and large increased in the motor vehicle industry. So if the number of imports reduce, then again your taxes will reduce.
Liquor industry, quite interesting. Beer, you reduce the taxes on beer.
Yeah.
This probably is like the first time that you heard from a budget speech that beer prices have been reduced. You expect that to go up. Why?
Well, again, I think that is to incentivize the tourism sector, because the majority of the consumption from on tourist side is in wine and beer, not really the hard liquor. Apparently, it's the Sri Lankans who consume most of the hard liquor. So it seems to be that we love our vehicles and we love hard liquor. So the beer has, yeah, as you said, the tax has reduced and the price will come down. Liquor tax has increased based on alcohol content, which is generally the basis other countries.
Again, trying to tax the innocent people of Sri Lanka, isn't it?
Yes, but liquor is not something very essential. So,
thank you very much, Shaman Tilakaratna, Director Tax Services, PwC. Now her colleague, Duminda Hulagama, Ernst & Young Sri Lanka partner. When you look at the budget, you start thinking, what is the government trying to get at now? No discussion about SOEs that are making losses after losses. You have $1.5 billion tranche coming in from the IMF. $1 billion is the loss of Sri Lankan Airlines alone. Nothing spoken of. Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, nothing. Electricity Board, nothing. What is the government trying to get at?
No, I don't think so, because if you look at the budget speech, he has very clearly mentioned about public sector reform. He has mentioned about Hilton Properties, the Hotel Developers Limited, which owns Hilton Property, the Hyatt Property, at least the Hyatt building, which is owned by Insurance Corporation. The non-strategic investments divestiture has been mentioned. The divestiture of a percentage of the two state-owned banks have been mentioned. So there is reference to divestiture of state-owned enterprises for purpose of reform has been mentioned. Now, Sri Lankan has not been mentioned specifically, but I think Sri Lankan Airlines reform process is going on. I mean, it's an ongoing process. I don't know whether you mention it in the budget.
At the end of the day, Duminder, innocent people's tax money is going to be wasted on this white elephant.
Correct. So actually now, you see, you have to be strategic in this whole issue also.
Oh,
right?
so
if a government
strategic now.
Yeah, so if a government comes and says, okay, we are going to privatize electricity board tomorrow or CPC tomorrow, you know, the resistance within CB and CPC is expected, right? You know, I mean, they are not going to take it easily. They'll go on the streets, they'll strike. You know what happened 2 weeks ago without petrol, you know. So government also must, in my view, if I was government also, I would set the soft targets first. And privatize one or two and show the success of those events, those privatizations or divestitures or whatever you call it. And then go to the next item. But if you take the hard one first, everything else will fail. So in my view, even if CPC, if it is making losses, in my view, CPC should be reformed, CEB, all those things should be looked at. But if you take the most sensitive and the controversial one first, rest of it is going to collapse. So you take the soft one first, make success of that, and then go to the more difficult one. And that should be the approach. The government has mentioned that, I thought, very clearly in the minister's speech about public sector reform, need to divestiture, need to raise funds for state-owned banks among customers and employees. So I think that has been very clearly mentioned.
Thank you very much, the Minister for Ernst & Sri Lanka partner. I now move my attention to Dr. W. Wijewardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. I want to take a cue from what Duminda mentioned now. The government wants to target on the soft targets and then move on to the bigger ones. However, when you really heard the speech made by State Minister of Finance Eran Wickramaratne at the KPMG Budget Forum, he says, we may be out of office because we are not doing populist things. We are doing things that we think are in the best interest of the country in the long term. This sure should have mentioned about Sri Lankan Airlines. The last 7 years, in every speech that was made, Sri Lankan Airlines was taken into discussion. We spoke about Mahindra, we spoke about Sri Lankan Airlines, and none of this is being spoken of.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the track record of the government in the last 2-year period, Samir, with respect to the SOE reforms, the work that they had done is very little work they have done. I mean, there's a special ministry to take the reform program forward. Even at that ministry level, there had not been anything done to reform the Sri Lankan Airlines, CEB, then things like Petroleum Corporation. So there has been a failure on the part of the government, and unless they do it on a priority basis with the next 2 to 3 year period, it will become a huge monster who will eat up all the resources of the country. And
certainly the government will be out of power by 2020 if it goes like this.
Yeah, what would happen is, now, of course, the government can continue to remain in power if it doesn't go into these hard reforms immediately. But what matters is that if we are to attain this high economic growth and become a rich nation by 2045, we may have to go into the economic reform program, a very essential one, and as a result, what Minister Eran Wickramaratne has said is correct. But of course, what I find is there is no will on the part of the government to go into the depth of the problem and make the reforms.
Dr. Wijewardena, I want to drag attention back to the year 2003. The UNP government at that time, it was a similar fashion. You had President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga as the president. You had Ranil Wickremesinghe as the prime minister. The prime minister took a very hard stand and said that no jobs would be given. And in 2004, what happened was they were out of power. 2020, will something similar happen?
No, 2020 they might be out of power because of the opposite reason. Because by giving jobs and also driving the economy to a bankruptcy.
Thank you very much, Dr. W. Wijewardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Very quickly, so you don't agree with Duminda's argument here?
No, there has not been any work done. I mean, it's not an appreciable work.
I'll give you 20 seconds, Duminda, to answer that.
I never said they were doing anything. I only said that there's reference to public sector reform in the budget.
No, but
they have not done it.
Not the white elephants.
Yeah, but the white elephants, can you do it? I mean, you can see there are two parties in government. There is opposition within for privatization.
It was a farce. You saw the Chinese agreement on the Hamad report. They said the money is coming in. Now they say it's coming in 2 tranches. What are they talking about? They're trying to mislead the public?
No, it will come. I think they are waiting for some agreements. From what I understand, certain concessions to be granted.
So why did they lie to the public in February?
Sorry?
They lied to the public in February. They said the money is coming in. Okay, a classic example. I now move to Mr. Rajendra Thiagaraja, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Thiagaraja, 992, you come back very optimistic about the country's future. I want to drag your attention to 2018. Let's talk about 2018. The government wants to make Sri Lanka want to move out of state sector, to move out of fuel related cars. So you want either hybrid or you want electric cars in the state sector. That was what was articulated by Minister Mangala Samaraweera. Is this reflecting the budget 2018? I'll tell you why it's not. They increased taxes on hybrid cars, 750,000 upwards. You have same CC cars like the petrol vehicles increased only by 250,000 to 500,000. So where is government's vision coming into play as far as budget 2018 is concerned? There is no reflection, is it?
You're right. I think in this particular aspect there is inconsistency, but the only thing I would say is we've also got to understand the vision statement is spread over a certain period, multi-year, whereas the budget is a 12-month instrument. So there is only a certain amount you can include and do within 12 months.
So what is the government trying to say? You have electric cars, the prices drastically coming down. They made a mistake in 2017 as well. They increased electric prices, the taxes on electric cars, and then they suddenly reduced after President Maithripala Sirisena intervened. So they make mistakes after mistakes. It's like a testing ground for the government, and the people of Sri Lanka are like the pawns in this, isn't it?
Shavik, no, actually, one of the reasons that there is a discrepancy between the taxes of the hybrid vehicles and the petrol vehicles is that there's also a changeover from the type of calculation methodology. From previously there were two methods, which now they're cancelling out and bringing just one method based on cubic centimeters. So as a result, because of that changeover, there is a arbitrage in the taxes. But the change has had to be done, because otherwise, as Dhuminder said, the people were playing around with the valuations.
But Mr. Thiagaraja, is it really reflecting? Because the point is very simple. We are looking at moving towards a hybrid and electric car country, and we have prices of vehicles which are petrol based or diesel based coming down. And what is the thinking? My point is, to the ordinary layman, how does it really reflect? Are they supposed to buy a petrol car, or are they supposed to buy a hybrid car?
I think if the policy is encouraging towards hybrid and electric, the engagement has to go that way. But I also understand in this process, it's a self-learning process. I don't think in a coalition government you can expect everything to work perfectly. As long as there is a will to learn from mistakes, it's a self-learning process.
Mr. Thiagaraja, before I move to Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, again one of your colleagues. Mr. Thiagaraja, I'm still trying to wonder what the government is trying to do with the 2018 budget. There was no magic wand in the hands of Mangala Samaraweera, that is certain. There were no big-time tax concessions or nothing of that sort. But is there a thinking behind all this? Would we see drastic increase of taxes in the next few months? We see this very often in Sri Lanka. They have a budget, and mid-year they realize that they don't have money, so they impose, bring in appropriation bills and start passing major amounts of money. Will we see this happening at least in the year 2020?
Well, we certainly hope not, but I think, as Dhuminder earlier articulated, a key capacity builder was the introduction of the new Indian Revenue Bill, which I think encompassed a whole series of reforms to bring in a certain amount of certainty. Now the question is whether we will keep that, have the courage to retain that over the next few years, and to give the degree of certainty the public and business is expecting, despite elections looming and despite pressures coming in. So that will show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendra Thiagaraja, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Does Budget 2018 reflect the hallmarks of the International Monetary Fund? Your time starts now.
Well, let's start off with what you were referring to with Tuminda saying that nothing has been referenced to SOEs. If you look in detail at the speech, especially the annexures, there is a clear mention or a reference to SOEs and their obligations, especially if you look at CPC and CEB and taking a 2018 futuristic forecast as to the losses that they make or the profits that they'll make. So they have taken this into account in the framework of the national budget. And this, I think, is something that has not been done in the past, where you're looking forward, you're looking ahead into some of these SOEs and forecasting, okay, this will be the loss that these SOEs will have, and this is how much we need to balance around it.
I beg to disagree with you. Every single time Sri Lankans do a forecast, like the Public Utilities Commission, it is not right. Because has the government's vision of going electric, having electric charging points, has that been reflected on the Public Utilities Commission forecast? The answer is no. We had a discussion right here on Face the Nation. That has not been reflected.
But at least on this, they will know, okay, we've used $50 a barrel and priced in our forecast. If it moves above this, okay, we'll have a shortfall of this.
We have an energy crisis in Sri Lanka. We have the port city that is coming up. They don't know where to provide the electricity from to that particular area in question. We have an issue with the high-rising condominiums that are coming up. People don't know what's going to happen in the next few years. And that has clearly not been in the budget 2018 speech or the annexures or whatever it is, Shiran.
Well, I think we've not had this in the past, and having these forecasts is a starting point to have a discussion as to these risk scenarios. If this thing goes to this price, what happens? If we're not able to get a pricing formula, this is what's going to happen. And then they can recalibrate as the year goes on without figuring out, okay, we need taxes in July 2018 when we're short of money and prices are up. So this sort of provides a starting point, and your overall confusion as to what budget 2018 is all about sort of is maybe merited in the fact that maybe the budget is not supposed to cover everything under the sun.
Yeah, but
it's not supposed to
but the thing is,
give concessions. It's not supposed to give subsidies. It's not supposed to do all the reforms.
I agree with you.
It's supposed to give the policy
budgets across the world, in the Malaysia, Singapore model, you don't have everything covered. But the point is, in 2016, the government promised to have fuel price formula. Is that on? That was promised in the budget. Is that on? The answer is no. We are 3 years down the line, nothing has happened. And who are we trying to fool? Is it the innocent public who voted for this government, or is it someone else? The question is very simple.
So even on this front, they have not really talked about in the budget, but they have sort of like a commitment with the IMF in terms of the timelines to provide such a formula to them. So
this bears the hallmark of the International Monetary Fund getting intervened and trying to meddle with the country's economy.
I wouldn't say hallmark. If it was the hallmark, you would see more specific things in it, saying this is the specific timeline, this is the formula we're looking at. But that timeline again is something external to the budget. And this is something the budget should be congratulated on, is not putting everything that needs to be put into this one piece of document.
Thank you very much, Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I like your optimism always, Shiran, that you bring into the table. I open the floor for questions. Let's start off with Nana.
Hello, my question is coming to you, Mr. Wijewardena. I'd like to take you back to the beginning when you opened. You said this budget is not about appeasing the ordinary man. Would you say then that budget 2018 is neoliberalism hidden behind, sustainability?
Well, of course, the term neoliberalism may be a misnomer because the many people with leftist orientation would brand anything to do with economic reforms as neoliberal agenda, neoliberal propaganda. And here also since the budget has proposed so many economic reforms which are in line with the modern thinking of promoting an economy which is in trouble, which is not growing into a high growing economy, all the critics would think that it's a neoliberal type of an economic program. But what matters to us is this neoliberal simply means the people have the freedom of choice, and it's not the choice which is being restricted by any authority, any authority or any bureaucrat or any politician or any government party. And it has nothing to do with the type of reforms that we are planning to introduce to Sri Lanka, because those reforms have to be introduced whether we have a neoliberal economy or whether we have a restrictive economy or whether we have a controlled economy. Without those reforms, Sri Lanka is not in a position to move forward.
Sure, but those reforms then must also be kind of underlined with interventionist economic policy by the government to make sure that the little man is included.
Yeah, because the present economic ideology of the present government is to introduce the social market economy, in which the government would intervene in order to protect the vulnerable groups only, but basically the rest of the economic system will move forward by promoting competition, promoting free market economy system, by getting Sri Lanka integrated to the rest of the world, and as a result the vulnerable groups are always going to be looked after by any government, whether it is a free democratic government or a capitalist government or even a neoliberal government. It's a must, because without taking care of the vulnerable groups, there will be lots of social and political tensions, and with those political and social tensions society cannot move forward. And but at the same time we must see that the true spirit of competition should be promoted, so that we would be able to attain economic excellence, and by doing that only we would be able to connect ourselves to the rest of the world. So it's a kind of a hybrid system, and that hybrid system, it has nothing to do with the neoliberal or any other thing. Protect the vulnerable groups have to be protected by any government.
Right. This hybrid system, though, is obviously because of this sustainability rhetoric. We're assuming that it is motivated by the UN's SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think general public feel like the word sustainability is superficially used by the government to mean just the kind of cautiously management of resources so that the future generation would have renewable resources. But does it not also mean things like concepts like reducing inequality and increasing inclusion? And so whether it's neoliberal or something else, a social market economy, what are the hopes that we have that this government will, because these concepts are already very difficult to implement anyway, what are the hopes that we have that this will be done by this government, and how?
In fact, you are correct when you say that we have to look after the income gap. But of course, if you look at the history of Sri Lanka from independence, we find throughout that period, the 70 years that we had spent as an independent country, the income gap in Sri Lanka has been the same. The only difference that has happened in the recent past is that we have actually fattened the middle class at the expense of the poor people and also the rich people. And that middle class has become a very formidable force, and they are the people who fight against this item and all kinds of social interventions that they demand. That's the middle class. And other than that, the normal income distribution in Sri Lanka, which Sri Lanka had at the time of independence, the same distribution we have in year 2016 also. So that's it tells us that the failure of Sri Lankan authorities to have a narrower income distribution, despite many economic policies that they have undertaken, pro-poor policies, simply they have not worked in Sri Lanka.
Shiran, one question to you. June 2016 saw the IMF approve a $1.5 billion loan for Sri Lanka to support the country's economic reform agenda. Soon thereafter, we saw a complete overhaul of the Inland Revenue Department with the new act coming in. There were several issues with this RAMIS system, which was previously used, now not being able to be used. And now we have a completely new system in place. We have a completely new act in place. What is the role of the IMF in this whole thing? I mean, December this year, that is next month, we'll see the third review coming up as well. Exactly 1 year ago, at the exact same program, I remember Dr. Vijay Wardana saying, when I asked him, are we dancing to the tunes of the IMF? He said it's a misnomer and that we aren't. What is your take on this 1 year after?
Well, 1 year after we have introduced the Inland Revenue Act, it's supposed to go live from the 1st of April. The Inland Revenue Department really does need to get used to the new act, and I think there are certain administration issues which sort of needs to be taken care of. I think Duminder can elaborate much more on this subject. But whether we're dancing the tunes, I don't think so, but we're following sort of our own plan. I mean, if we were dancing to the tune, we would have had a pricing formula by now. But the political realities have set in, and we're sort of doing it at our own pace. This December, I think the key thing that they'll be looking at is this budget to see whether, are we going on that path where we're reducing the deficit. If, for example, this was more of a populist budget, more subsidies, more handouts, even greater increases in allowances, then the IMF would have seen it quite negatively and would have fallen into a bit more trouble in terms of getting a disbursement. But overall, I think it would tick most of the boxes that they were looking for prior to the next disbursement.
Mr. Tyagaraja, I don't mean to paint a bleak picture, but do you think that some of the priorities are being missed out through this budget? If we take very simple, basic issues of the common man, I'll give you several examples. We talk about promoting tourism, but we don't talk about protecting the rights of, say, the beach boys. We don't talk about creating awareness about HIV/AIDS. We talk about introducing robotics, nanotechnology into universities, but we don't talk about the alarming rate of ragging, sexual abuse, depression in universities. We talk about bringing down electric buses, but we don't talk about allocations to curb sexual harassment in public transport. Issues like this, which affect the common man in Sri Lanka, don't you think the government also needs to focus its attention on these burning issues which are faced by the majority of Sri Lankans?
So I would say that it's not just the government's responsibility. There is also an opportunity for the private sector to get involved in this, and I think that comes in the form of social impact investing.
Right.
And I think, especially if you look at some of the issues you mentioned, also in some of the newly liberated areas, you still have some of these issues. So you're right, even before we get to AI and robotics, you need to address some of these social issues. And I don't think it's the government alone can do that, but I think what we could have seen is a bit more incentives for the private sector to get involved and invest in some of these social impact issues. Say, for example, when we speak about harassment, sexual harassment or harassment of women, single parent families, the fact that you can connect them to the value chain more effectively. Things like that could have been done a bit more in terms of a better pronouncement and encouragement of social impact investment rather than pure private sector commercial investment. So I do agree with you, yes.
Right. So what we're missing is a sense of direction by the government. Is that what you're saying?
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, yesterday I happened to participate in one of the young youth startup forums, which is all to do with high-tech ICT. But what we don't realize is a lot of that conversation comes based on Colombo and the Western Province, when you also have a parallel ecosystem outside that which needs far more capacity building in social impact reforms before they can get into this space. So you're right.
Duminder, what do you think was thinking behind the tax on telecommunication towers, and how do you think it's going to impact the industry?
Well, it's just pure revenue raising measure, there's nothing else. I mean, to raise revenue, there need not be a rationale. It is how to bridge the deficit. because we have a deficit financing mechanism in our budgeting, you know, how we first work out the expenditures and how to bridge it. So you tap wherever that is possible, wherever that is very large volumes, rather than, say for example, they're expecting something in the range of about 10 to 15 billion from this
13
billion from this telecom tower tax
and 2 billion from this.
So I mean, collecting income tax 13 billion to collect, you need about 1,000 taxpayers, but you have only 6 telco companies or 5 telco companies, so it's collecting 5 people is much easier than collecting from 1,000 people. Of course the telco companies will then thereafter, if the regulator permissibly increase prices, can pass it down. So there's another way of collecting taxes, because that is also more efficient way of collecting taxes than collecting tax for 1,000 people. So
how exactly are they going to implement this? Is it 2 rupees per call?
No, there's nothing 2 rupees. No, there is no 2 rupees per call.
That's
not there is no reference to a 2 rupees to call in the proposal. It is 200,000 per month per tower. So there are some X number of towers that into the per month 200,000 to 12 with 13 billion required. So that is how it's going to be implemented.
Shaman, I have a question for you. The removal of the 15% VAT on exemption on condominiums. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this was in place about a year ago?
So, yeah, so correct. It was exempt, now it's made liable.
So isn't it, doesn't it fall under policy inconsistency of the government? And I mean, 12 months down the line you get another change.
Yeah. Yes, the VAT on condominium property has undergone some frequent change over the past few years. But there again, it's there could be two things behind it. One, of course, is, as Duminda says, is your revenue generation mechanism. Second is, within the industry also there is sort of a difference in opinion and a confusion. Some want to be liable so that they can claim the input credit on the VAT, and so it will reduce their cost to an extent. So those are the real two reasons behind the implementation of VAT on condominium property.
And I think there is a move to encourage vertical living, right?
Yes.
So this seems to be contradicting government direction. What do you think about that?
Well, again, vertical living, so there are two aspects to that. So you have one segment of the market, which is your expats and your the diaspora, who are outside and who are wealthy enough to invest in these apartments. Then of course you get the type of apartments which are the lower middle income earners and the low income earners. So the majority of these condominium properties are aimed at the upper middle class. So the thinking there again is that the increase won't affect the market sentiment too much, and it's a good source of revenue, because condominium is a big market out there.
Dr. Vijayawardena, there's a concept developed by Professor Nassim Nicholas Taleb called anti-fragility, which is a property of systems that increase in capability, resilience as a result of stresses, shocks, volatility, noise, mistakes and failures. My question to you is the Sri Lankan psyche and mindset now becoming immune to errors, haphazard policies and short-sighted actions by government, given the previous inconsistencies, non-implementations and uncertainty in previous budget proposals?
You are exactly correct. I mean, we are in that particular world now, and you would have seen whatever the mistakes done by the politicians, we don't raise our voice. By our own citizens on the street, when we drive motor vehicles, when they violate the traffic laws, again we don't raise our voice. When the policeman hits someone who is standing in a queue to buy his fuel, again we don't raise our voice. So we have become a kind of a de-numbed population, and which means that the kind of fragility is now developing within our social psyche in Sri Lanka. You are correct, perfectly correct. We are in that particular state now.
Dr. Vijayawardena, the budget 2018 has proposed to allow the two state banks to raise equity and debt capital, right? So now what has been suggested, I think, is to issue shares for employees and depositors, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it has a history, Charita, because the reason why the capital base of the two state banks got depleted was in 2016 the previous Minister of Finance, not under the Inland Revenue Act but under the Finance Act, he gave directions to the state banks, National Savings Bank, People's Bank and the Bank of Ceylon, to transfer almost the entirety of their surplus to the treasury, so that the government got a huge boost in the income, and they were able to show that the revenue of the government has gone up from 13% to 14.2%. And the result was that the surplus that had been remaining within those banks got depleted. Now they are deficient in capital, and the capital has to be provided by the new finance minister. Now what it means is the taxpayers, we as taxpayers will have to now bear the burden. So either it is by the general treasury or by the members of the public now, because already the two state banks have issued debentures, and therefore they have satisfied the requirement of the tier 2 capital under Basel III, and therefore there is no more possibility for them to issue another set of debentures and raise this money. So
Mr. Agrawal, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would like to add, I mean, while respecting Vijay's comments, but there is another side to this. It's not about privatization. I think what is given is the opportunity for these two banks, if they chose to list or use that tool to raise additional liquidity or capital. And I think they are doing this, in addition to what Vijay says, for a different reason as well, because these two banks collectively command still around 40-45% of the banking sector. So whatever private banks do in terms of good governance and policy, if these two don't get into that space, you're not going to see a real improvement or influence. And what happens is, when you list, regardless of privatizing, you raise the bar of expectation. And if you really look at our region, the best two examples we have is State Bank of India in India and State Bank of Pakistan, which did this almost a decade ago, probably only making about 10% available to the general public, but by listing, it raised the market cap of those institutions to a complete different ball game. And in fairness, I think here what is also, because almost any fund manager who looks at Sri Lanka, they first say, when are you going to list, not to privatize? So there is an opportunity by doing that to also bring up the capital market to a different level, and give the opportunity for the depositors and staff members, if they choose to also participate in part of it.
Does fund managers really look at that aspect?
Oh yes, they do.
Every time.
Every time. I mean, international fund manager look at as they are, 100% agree what Tia says, is that more than selling shares to the customers or depositors or privatizing, it is the transparency of this institution that we improve by listing. So listing per se, government can still own it. You will increase the transparency, you increase the bar of these institutions.
But does the Banking Act allow a
listing? No, not the Banking Act. Charita, both the People's Bank Act and the Bank of Ceylon Ordinance will have to be amended, because those two acts, the legislation do not provide for listing of the two state banks or to issue shares to the members of the public. So there is a parliamentary process through which the entire listing and the issue of shares to either employees or the depositors has to be approved in terms of the parliamentary processes.
And Charita, also what happened in India's case and Pakistan's case, they did not necessarily issue shares in New York or in London. What they did was, as you would know, they issued an instrument called a global depository note, where the underlying shares were kept in custody in Sri Lanka, but any fund manager or international investor could trade in the warrants or the instrument which was traded somewhere. That raised a different level of liquidity.
Devinder, in Minister Mangal Samarira's speech, he started off congratulating the former Minister of Finance, Ravi Karunanika. there's a notion amongst the public in Sri Lanka saying Minister Karunayaka is probably one of the worst finance ministers that the country ever had. And then you have the present finance minister congratulating for a steady economic policy decisions taken by the former finance minister. Was it really necessary in a budget?
Well, whether necessary or not is a different issue, but I must say that there is some credit that is due to the former finance minister as well. I mean, what other issues may be. I had the chance of working with him very close in the last 2 years. I must admit that the tax reform process was commenced by him. The inland revenue reform process, the increase of the VAT to 15%, I mean, he had the courage and the guts to increase to 15% amongst a lot of opposition within the government and outside the government. And to get the inland revenue RAMI system augmented, I think he did a lot of reform. He started a lot of reforms. And I must agree to that. I think I agree with what Honorable Mangalasamy said. I worked with him for the last 2 years very close, and I think he had a genuine interest in boosting government revenue and commencing the reform process.
Mr. Tyagaraja, sorry. Mr. Tyagaraja, I want to come to you on again something you said at the beginning, but I want to talk about urban development. And obviously urban development is really important to this budget, to this government, because we're hinging a lot on foreign investment, and the best way to do that is to develop our western region. And the Urban Development Authority, the Western Region Megapolis Plan, boasts that they're heading towards a zonal approach in planning. What that means is they're going to zone out areas and call it the financial hub and, the lower income residential, etc. So this is a very fragmented and very, promote segregation and a clear gentrification. My question is, when we have Manning Market being picked up and moved to, Paligoda, how can we expect the government to support the little man, the Kade, as Mangalasamy mentioned in his speech? How can we expect them to support the little small businesses? Not only that, where are they going to take place spatially in the country?
I think while we speak about urban development, I think what the Honourable Finance Minister mentioned, and probably what the vision statement also mentioned, is not necessarily about megapolis and the 5 million people in that sector. There's another 15 million people out there, outside the Western province. They need connectivity. And I think what is probably now available is through this process, the opportunity for that segment as well, through empowerment, forming of companies for youth, for differently able, for women, and also through the new Grama Shakti program at the village unit, forming companies limited by guarantee in a small way, allowing people to build that economic, at least start that economic resilience, and then give the opportunity for them to connect with the rest of the value chain. I think that's probably more important than focusing attention on, as you say, urban development, because there is far more.
I agree with you, but do you think that the urban poor is represented in the budget?
Urban poor.
Poor.
Yes.
Yes, Dr. Wijewardena.
I think yes. Yes, there is.
It has been. Yes, Shaman, you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, so as Mr. Tyagaraja mentioned, all this, the credit schemes and then the concessionary loan rates, which have been identified at various sector level, is aimed at the urban development.
Sure, but spatially, are they identified? Do they have a space in Colombo district or Colombo, the economic hub that we're creating? Because we're weaning the urban poor out.
It depends on the business you're in, right? I mean, certain startups or businesses really, you don't need a shop or something particular. You can connect on to e-commerce, things like that, even if you're a small seller as a whole. But what you've seen, I mean, with your point on urbanization, is it's not a planned system that we've had in the last few decades or so. So it's not like there was a plan or intention for this area to be this and this area to be that. It has all sprawled up. So now it's about sort of recalibrating that and not making zones as per se, but making it easier for businesses to allocate here, for transport and things like that to happen. So It's a
Charles,
change in that side.
I'll give you an opportunity to pose the final question.
Yeah, Dr. Vijayawardena, my final question is to you. Banks have raised concerns saying that they will face a 20 billion rupee impact on profits if this debt repayment levy is not passed on to the consumer. Now, this also comes in the backdrop of banks being asked to comply with Basel III capital requirements. Going by all this, do you think this would be withdrawn by the government?
That's what I said, that when it comes to because this question was raised by Nadeem earlier, there has been a tendency for this government to withdraw most of the proposals that they make if there is serious public pressure for that. Now here, of course, though the government doesn't expect the banks to pass it on to the customers, we know through experience they know enough means of passing it on to their own customers by way of fees, charges and so forth. So as a result, the guarantee that has been given by the government that it will not be passed on to the customers but it will be absorbed by the banking sector may not be a realistic one. So eventually it will be a big blow to the banking sector, because now Mr. Tyagaraja was saying that they were effectively paying about 45%, but in my calculations some time back was as a percentage of income, if you take the as a percentage of profits, the banking sector is paying about 65 to 70%. That's the highest tax industry in Sri Lanka.
Which was brought down subsequently over a few years ago to this 40.
Yeah.
But again, if I may add something to what Vijay says, is maybe there is still an opportunity for those who brought this levy to seriously consult the central bank and the monetary board, which is responsible for monetary policy, and to see whether this will seriously impede or not the financial stability of banks. I think that's important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and the lady, again for your thoughts in the first, second and third and fourth rounds. We're now going for a short commercial break. This is Face the Nation. When we come back, it's the final round. Stay connected, stay with us. Welcome back. It's the final round. I start off with Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Shiran, blue-green budget, the government has targeted at generating an environmentally sustainable economic growth. Let's talk about the most powerful nation in the world, like the US, is now moving out completely from this green economic vision that Barack Obama had. And little Sri Lanka is concerned about the environment now. Do you think this is the way to go? 2018, are we focusing on the right thing? Are we having our priorities straight? Time starts now.
Well, I mean, we can't always compare ourselves against America and other countries, but in our own little way, I think the situation sort of demands it. I mean, the energy plans that we have are not entirely in place. We need a more grander vision. We have a lot of vehicles on the road which are emitting as well, so it seems like a plausible plan. Even things like the carbon tax that we're sort of putting in place have been done in other countries. Moving into electric vehicles, even the 2040 target is something that other countries have also put in place as well. So while we're aligning maybe to the global standards or the global outlook, we are also, I think, looking at other ways to better improve our own systems.
Shiran, when we have looked at respective budgets over the years that has been presented by respective governments, we always see 3 to 4 months after, there are reforms again added. There are taxes slapped. There are appropriation bills that are brought forward. Government, ministers, parliamentarians need vehicles, so on and so forth. Will this all be practical for a country like Sri Lanka? We're talking about the future. And do you think 2018 will see similar patterns as well?
So I think the bouquets or the compliments we're giving the budget right now will really be only valid maybe in 4 or 5 months, as you said, whether we'll continue to say the same things. So that's where this whole implementation unit will actually come into place, because if they report monthly as they're sort of reporting, and they sort of say, okay, this is not being put in place, we might see additional external appropriation things put in to sort of get more revenue and things like that. So as always, as we've said last year as well, I think it really depends on this whole implementation and trying as much as possible, I think, to limit the backtracking, because I think once you open that door, implementation just goes out the window.
Thank you very much, Iran Fernando, Chief Economist, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to Mr. Rajan Thiagaraja, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Also, the private sector is now looking at least for a glimmer of hope. If I ask Charmaine or Duminda how many companies are up for sale, they might say that's top secret, so I'm not going to even pose that question to them. Given the country's economy right now, 2018, where does the private sector stand? Do you think that we'll see something substantial for the private sector? Because we know only a few blue chip companies are making money right now. Their top line growth looks very healthy. But all the other companies who were doing great over the last 5 years are now not making ends meet. 2018, what's your message for the private sector?
To be optimistic, look for the opportunities. Don't always wait for the government to give. Let's see what we can do ourselves.
But does it always work, Mr. Thiagaraja?
I think it does. If I give you one example, not wearing the chamber hat, but the hat which the company I'm currently working for, on the sphere of education, we keep on talking about the graduate which comes out and how unsuitable or suitable the person is for employment. And we've taken a very major decision recently, and we have announced a program to recruit 500 agnostic of the degree background, on condition that we put them through a 2-year training program to cleanse, remove the chip on the shoulder, and give them a complete different orientation, which will obviously result in a degree, but it will be modular and it will have to be earned with practical background to suit our requirements. So instead of lamenting at the authorities and the university, we are taking it upon ourselves. And I think there is the opportunity for other private sector companies as well and corporates to take these sort of problems onto ourselves. Instead of saying what will the government give us, what can we do to build capacity?
It sounds all well and good when John F. Kennedy said that ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you. It sounds very good and it sounds very realistic, but given our system in place, we see that tender procedures being violated. We see so much of red tape. 2018, Mr. Thiagaraja, can the private sector say the government is going to stand with us, they're going to help us, they're going to help us strengthen ourselves and move forward, there'll be growth? Would that happen?
Well, at least we have the opportunity, the private sector has the opportunity to engage constructively with the government and the authorities. But I think that the message for the private sector is also, let's not only depend on the government. Policy advocacy, yes, but let us also get on with doing what we have to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendra Thiagaraja, Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. He's also a well-respected banker. I now move my attention to Charmaine Thiagaraja, Director, Tax Services, PwC. Charmaine, you're not going to tell me how many companies are for sale, aren't you? Right? So, when it comes to the country's economy in the year 2018, do you think we'll see something good happening? Because we have very optimistic targets. We are talking about where we stand in terms of making Sri Lanka a miracle, 5,000 GDP, as far as 5,000 per capita income. We're looking at new things. We're looking at very optimistic targets. Some not even realistic. We're talking about a 6% rate as far as inflation is concerned. We're standing at 8.6% now. We don't have a proper plan for that. Do you think all this can be achieved, or is it just numbers? We've seen this number game happening right from 2009 onwards at the central bank report. Is this not a number game?
You're right. Numbers that have been in the past announced may not have been achieved. But, I mean, there has to be a number forecast, and then there has to be a target to work towards to achieve. The important thing is that the platform is created, or at least we start to create the platform towards moving towards that objective. And to that extent, this budget has laid out a very transparent and at least very identifiable plans. As to whether they will work is anyone's guess. As to whether they'll be implemented is another question. But it's more structured this time, and the platform is at least being created towards moving towards a target.
So you mean to say the government has a proper plan, at least this time?
Yes.
They're not going to test and try Sri
It's
Lankans
just not sweeping statements or, you know, pretty rhetoric. It's tables, column-wise, identified, and it's there. So either we achieve it or we can lay blame.
Isn't it too early to predict the future?
Yes, that's why I said it's either achievable or not. It will miss the target, but at least we're moving towards it.
At least we're having some numbers on the plate.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Shaman Thekaratne, Director Tax Services, PwC. Duminda, you're not going to tell me either how many companies are for sale. I
don't know.
Duminda, you've always been an optimist about the country's economy, country's future. I've interviewed you a couple of times since 2013. Even during President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, you've said things will turn around. 2015, there was major change. And then you came in 2016 and said the same thing. 2017, you said the same thing. 2018, give me something else.
No, I think the change you mentioned was a political change, but the economy was performing well then and it's performing well now as well. I mean, the dynamism may be still absent, but I think the conditions have changed. But as you said, well, I am optimistic 2018 as much as it was for 17. Because from a fiscal point of view, the targets that have been given, at least the reforms that have been proposed, are very minimal. So it's a question of implementing what has already been done. So from income tax, VAT, NBT, etc., I don't think there's much to do in order to achieve. But the numbers to achieve, the economy must grow. If the economy does, for example, we are expecting about 15% tax revenue growth. So that's taking about a 5% growth and 10% inflation. So if the economy expands, the economy grows, then the tax revenues will grow. If the tax revenues grow, then the deficit becomes easy to finance. But if the tax revenues don't grow, which means if the economy doesn't grow, tax revenues don't grow, then deficit might be difficult to finance and without the borrowings, and the interest rates will go up, inflation will go up. So it's very difficult to say whether we can achieve or not. But I'm hoping they will be achieved. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we must talk about para-tariffs and because by removing a lot of para-tariffs that were currently imposed on a lot of consumer items and raw materials, you are encouraging, to answer her question earlier, how can the benefit go down to the people, is that if Sri Lanka industry can be more competitive, then the benefit of their competition will go to the people, so that you don't give protection to industries every day. So I think that is also need to be mentioned, because that also might have an impact on how the economy is going to move.
Devinder, I assume you go to the market to shop once a day or two. Do you?
I don't.
You don't?
So but I know the prices generally.
Excuse me?
I know the prices because I asked my wife.
Okay, you know the prices. So since 2014, you've told me about the country's economy and how optimistic you are. Since 2014, look at the prices of rice. Right now, a price of a coconut is just over 100 rupees. People are disgruntled about the country's economy. People are disgruntled about the country's inflation. And you, a partner at ENY, stands so confident about the future.
No.
Why?
No, because the prices have always been going up. If you ask the price in 77, it was much lower.
So of course, I'm just doing a comparison since I last interviewed you in 2014. Yes.
It just keeps going on every day. I mean, every time you say, if you talk to your parents, you say, during our times, bread was so much, the bus fare was so much, petrol was so much. So it will go on. I mean, 10 years later, we'll tell our children when we were in school, when we were your age, this was the price of something. So I think I don't think any country or any country in the world can control the increase in prices, because demand is increasing, supply is dwindling. So always there will be a few goods and more people to ask for it. I mean, the coconut example, in my view, is because of the urbanization. The number of plantation is coming down. So fragmentation has taken place. So because of that, the production is going down. That is the answer to coconut, because I come from a coconut growing area. So so government needs to do needs policyization for coconut, but vegetables and all those things, they keep going up and down. So
because there was a time, Dumind, I don't know whether you would agree, they used to say at least we can have some pulsambol and some rice.
Yeah.
And now they say pulsambol, oh no, we don't want to even go close. So in a few years' time, you might have to tell your kids, look here, the price have gone up by 500%.
Yeah.
You don't have to give them the numbers. Thank you very much, Dumind, for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on board.
Thank you.
I'll finish off tonight with Dr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Dr. Vijayawardena, if you want to see some changes in this good, bad and worse budget, what changes do you envisage? What message do you have for the government?
The main focus should be to continue with the economic reform program. Without the economic reforms, I don't think Sri Lanka has a future. And government should have commitment, will, courage and also a vision to introduce the required economic reforms within the next 2 to 3 year period, so that by year 2025, when we have the final year of this Vision 25, we would be able to at least attain certain goals of the Vision 2025. About the mid-term goals of Vision 2025, they are already gone now, because the government was thinking of increasing the per capita income to $5,000 level by year 2020. That is already gone, because for us to have that amount of per capita income, the average economic growth during 2018, 2019 and 2020 should be about 9%. But the budget itself has now downscaled the growth rate 4.5% in 2017 to go up to 5.5% by year 2020. So which means the mid-term economic targets are already totally ignored. They are just numbers, as you have said. Then the target to double the exports from 10 billion to 20 billion by year 2020, that is also not to be realized. So with facing these issues, I think the good thing should be to take the reform program forward, as Mr. Iran Vikramaratne has already mentioned, according to you. Otherwise they will be out of power.
Thank you very much, Dr. W. Vijayawardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Iran, for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on board. Thank you very much, Shamik. It's your first time joining us this evening. It's always nice to have individuals like you coming on the show as well. Dr. Vijayawardena, it has always been a pleasure to have you on Face the Nation. You've always said a yes whenever asked to come on the show. Thank you very much, Dr. Vijayawardena, for attending the show tonight as well. Mr. Rajan Triagrawala, Chairman of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. A couple of years back when I interviewed you, I never thought that you would be the Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. There's more responsibility now lying on your shoulders, and people are, in particular the private sector, looking forward to what changes you would do as far as a silent chamber was concerned in the last couple of years. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And then Dumind, the optimist as far as the tax, the mechanisms and all that is concerned. In a few years from now, Dumind, I hope and pray that things will improve in Sri Lanka and would be in the right track. Thank you very much, Nadeem. Thank you very much, Nanel. Thank you very much, Charita. And thank you very much, Sonali, for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have Sonali and Charita and Nadeem on board. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do, but what is important to understand is the fact that it's a blue-green budget. Will the blue and the greens survive at least next year without any problem? Now that is a question mark, isn't it? Let's close tonight with a quote, as I always do. However beautiful the strategy is, you should occasionally at least look at the results. Take care and good night.